July 25th, 1944. Asen Point Internment Facility, Guam. The air in the processing hut smelled of canvas, lye, and urine. Chio gripped the hand of Akiko, the youngest nurse whose shivering was near silent, a vibration against Chio's own ribs. Dawn. This was the hour the propaganda films had promised. The hour the American Oni, the devils, began their work. Outside, gravel crunched under heavy boots. A heavy metal bolt slid back. The women pressed tighter into the corner, a knot of gray-green uniforms. Chio squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the shout, the kick, the inevitable violation. "Akiko," she whispered, her own throat tight. "Hold your honor. Do not shame your family." The door swung open. Silence. No, not silence. A smell. Impossible. Rich, dark coffee. Salted meat. Chio opened her eyes. The Marine, a corporal, impossibly tall, was placing a steaming metal tray on the dirt floor. He didn't look at them. He just set it down and backed away, adhering to the small typewritten sign tacked to the doorframe. IAW Geneva Convention. No fraternization. No harm. The scent of scrambled eggs and bacon hit them like a physical blow. It was the smell of a life they thought was gone forever. We often explore these forgotten moments where humanity defied the rules of war. If this story resonates, consider subscribing to see how history unfolded differently, and perhaps comment with your own country's untold stories. 6 weeks earlier, Saipan. The air in the cave was too thick to breathe. It was a hot, wet blanket, tasting of sulfur, cordite, and human waste. Chio pressed a filthy strip of gauze against the soldier's neck. It was useless. The blood, dark and sluggish, simply soaked through the fabric and over her fingers. He was the last one left. A boy from Hokkaido, whose name she had forgotten 3 days ago. His breath was a shallow rasp, a small noise lost in the symphony of the war outside. Thump, hiss. Another mortar round landed near the cave mouth, shaking dust from the limestone ceiling onto their faces. The boy did not flinch. "They are coming," whispered Akiko, the younger nurse from the deepest shadow. "Chio-san, they are burning the caves." Chio heard it too, a deep, coughing roar that was not artillery, a flamethrower. She closed her eyes, and the propaganda posters bloomed against the darkness of her lids. Grinning American devils with horns and claws, dragging women away by the hair. The radio broadcasts had been clear. Capture meant torture. Capture meant rape. Capture meant a dishonor so profound that only death could cleanse it. Her small officer's pistol felt heavy in her pocket. Its single remaining bullet promised to herself, not the enemy. "We die," Chio said, her voice flat. It was not a question. "We keep our honor." The soldier beneath her hand gurgled, a finality to the sound. His body went slack. She had failed him. She was the last defense, and she had failed. "Chio-san!" Akiko screamed, pointing. A new sound. Boots scraping on the rocks at the entrance. A shadow blocked the sliver of gray light. Chio drew the pistol, her hand shaking violently. This was it. The moment of her death. She would not be taken. A cylindrical object flew through the air, landing softly on the cave's dirt floor. It was not a grenade. It did not explode. Instead, thick, gray smoke began to pour from it, acrid and choking, but not burning. Then, a voice. It was deep, terrifying, and speaking mangled Japanese. "Dete kudasai, byoin, anzen." Chio froze. Hospital. Safe. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. A trick to lure them out before the violation. The smoke was filling the small space, making her eyes water, stinging her throat. Akiko was coughing, a terrible, racking sound. "Mizu, bioin," the voice again. Water. Hospital. Chio looked at the dead soldier. She looked at her bloody, useless hands. She looked at Akiko, who was barely 16, The propaganda promised a monster. But the monster threw smoke, not fire. The monster offered water, not death. The lie was life. The truth was the death all around her. "Akiko," Chio gasped, shoving the pistol back into her pocket. "Cover your face. We are going out." She grabbed the younger nurse's hand and pulled her toward the light, emerging into the blinding July sun with her hands raised high. She was blinded by the light, by the shame, by the incomprehensible choice to live. The Marines who grabbed them were rough, shouting in a language she could not understand. They were searched, bound, and blindfolded. The scratchy burlap of the blindfold smelled of rope and salt. As she was marched onto the rattling metal deck of a transport ship, Chio did not know where she was going. She only knew that she had failed her emperor, her family, and the boy from Hokkaido. She had chosen life, and she was certain it was the beginning of her torture. The journey from Saipan had been a blur of nausea and blindfolded stumbling. They were herded from the ship into trucks, the engines roaring so loud they could not speak. When the blindfolds were finally removed, they were here, Asan Point, Guam. It was not a prison of steel bars, but a sprawling city of tents and hastily constructed wooden huts, all enclosed by barbed wire. They were shoved into Hut 14, a long, low structure with a dirt floor and canvas flaps for windows. It smelled overwhelmingly of damp canvas, insecticide, and lye. Night fell, and with it came the cold. Not the sharp, clean cold of her home in Nagano, but a penetrating coastal dampness that settled deep in their bones. The 16 women in the hut huddled together for warmth on thin straw mats, their gray-green uniforms stiff with salt and sweat. For hours, the only sounds were the rhythmic buzzing of insects against the screens, the distant shout of a guard, and the quiet, suppressed sobs of the woman nearest the door. Chio lay awake, her eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling. Every propaganda story she had ever heard clawed at her mind. The humiliation was supposed to come first, then the interrogation. Dawn. They always started at dawn. The Americans were impatient, the propaganda officers had said. They would not wait long to begin their monstrous work. She had failed to die honorably. Now she had to face the consequence. Her only remaining duty was to endure it. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would not bring shame upon her family name. She rehearsed the pain in her mind, building walls against it. A small movement beside her. It was Akiko, the young nurse from the cave. Her shoulders were shaking. "Chio-san," Akiko whispered, her voice trembling. I am afraid." "We are all afraid," Chio said, her own voice harsher than she intended. "Be silent. Do not show them weakness." "I have something." Akiko fumbled inside her tunic. She brought out a small, hard object wrapped in paper. It was half of a dry rice cake, stale and gray. "I saved it. From the ship." Akiko pushed the offering into Chio's hand. "For you. You are the ranking nurse." Chio stared at the small, pathetic offering. It was likely the last piece of true Japanese food any of them possessed. Akiko, who was trembling with terror, was offering her last comfort. It was an act of profound, foolish, human decency. The gesture broke something inside Chio. This girl was not a soldier. She was a child. And Chio, as the ranking nurse, was responsible for her. Her focus shifted from the honorable death she had failed to achieve to the immediate life she had to protect. She gently pushed Akiko's hand back. "No," she whispered, forcing a calm she did not feel. "We will share it when the sun comes up." She paused. "We will face it together." It was a small lie, but it quieted Akiko shivering. Chio pulled the girl closer, letting her rest her head on her shoulder. Chio did not sleep. She watched the canvas window flap, waiting for the first hint of gray light, waiting for the sound of boots on the gravel, waiting for the devils to arrive. The gray light that Chio had been dreading finally arrived. It was not a gentle dawn, but a cold, sterile illumination that crept under the canvas flaps, painting the dirt floor in shades of ash. A woman whimpered in the corner. "They are here." Outside, the sounds began. Boots on gravel, heavy and rhythmic, a metallic clang like a gate being unlatched. Chio sat up, her spine rigid. She pulled Akiko behind her, shielding the younger nurse with her own body. This was the moment. The physical pain would be terrible, but it was the humiliation she truly feared. She thought of her father, a stern man who valued honor above all. She would not shame him. "It will be fast," Chio whispered, repeating the lie she had told herself all night. It was the same hollow reassurance from the cave. The bar on their hut door dropped with a heavy wooden thud. The door scraped open. 16 women huddled together, a mass of silent terror. Chio squeezed her, eyes shut, bracing for the first blow, the rough hand grabbing her hair, the barked command. 2 men entered. They were enormous, silhouetted against the morning light. They stopped just inside the doorway. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. But there was no shout. There was no blow. Instead, a smell washed over them. It was so foreign, so utterly impossible, that Chio's mind struggled to identify it. It was not the smell of blood, or fear, or lie. It was rich, dark, and nutty. It was the smell of roasted coffee. Beneath it, another scent, savory and smoky. Chio opened her eyes. The 2 soldiers were not wearing helmets. They were not carrying rifles or clubs. One of them, a younger man with red hair, was holding a large, steaming metal tray. The other, older, held a stack of metal cups. "Mornin', ladies," the older one said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. He set the cups down on a small, empty crate. The younger soldier placed the heavy tray beside it. It was a breakfast, a hot American breakfast. The tray was piled high with fluffy yellow scrambled eggs, strips of dark, crispy bacon, and thick slices of white bread. A large metal pot steamed, releasing that unbelievable aroma of coffee. The soldiers stepped back toward the door, observing them. They did not shout. They did not order. They simply waited. The women stared. They looked at the food, then at the soldiers, then back at the food. This was not in the propaganda. This was not interrogation. This was madness. Was it poison? A test? A final cruel joke before the real torture began? Akiko's stomach rumbled, a loud, mortifying sound in the silence. The red-haired soldier smiled. It was not the leering grin of a devil. It was a slightly awkward, almost shy smile. He pointed at the tray. "Eat. Please." He used the English word, simple and clear. "Eat." He and the other guard then stepped outside, closing the door gently behind them. Chio remained frozen for a full minute. She listened. There was no laughter outside, no gathering of more men. Just the distant sound of the camp waking up. Slowly, cautiously, she crept forward. She leaned over the tray. The steam from the eggs was real, warming her face. The bacon was perfectly cooked. It was more food, and better food, than she had seen in months, perhaps years. She looked at the other women. They were watching her, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. She was the ranking nurse. She had to act. Her hand trembled as she reached for a piece of the white bread. It was soft. She lifted it to her nose. It smelled of yeast and flour. It was real. She turned and offered it to Akiko. The spell was broken. The women surged forward, not fighting, but moving with a desperate, unified need. They used their hands, their fingers shaking, scooping the hot eggs, grabbing the bacon. They drank the coffee from the metal cups, scalding their tongues, but the warmth was immediate and profound. They ate in silence, a strange, shared ritual of stunned survival. Chio watched them. The Americans had not beaten them. They had not humiliated them. They had fed them. This simple act of kindness was more disorienting than any beating could have been. It had taken her entire worldview, her understanding of the enemy, of honor, of the war itself, and shattered it on the floor alongside the empty tray. For 2 weeks, the routine held. The terror of that first dawn had faded, replaced by a surreal, suspended reality. Every morning, the same 2 guards, the older one they called Smiles and the red-haired one, Freckles, would arrive with the steaming tray. Hot coffee, eggs, bacon, or sometimes oatmeal with canned peaches. The women ate. They were processed, given new plain uniforms, and subjected to medical examinations that were thorough but distressingly impersonal, not violent. They were not interrogated. They were not harmed. They were, it seemed, simply being held. Then came the order for work detail. The word labor reignited their fear. This perhaps was the start of the real humiliation. They were marched under guard, not to a quarry or a ditch, but to a long, open-air shed behind the main American field hospital. It was a laundry. Piles of sheets, surgical gowns, and uniforms were heaped in canvas bins. Giant metal tubs steamed with boiling water, the air thick with the caustic smell of lye soap. "This is the work," Chio told the others, her voice tight. "We will wash their uniforms." The women looked at the piles. Akiko picked up a khaki shirt, stained with mud and something darker. She held it as if it were a dead animal. To wash the clothes of the men who had killed their soldiers, their brothers, their fathers. It felt like a deep and profound betrayal. A male guard, one Chio had not seen before, leaned against a post, smoking a cigarette and watching them. His eyes lingered on the women as they bent over the tubs, and he made a low comment to his companion that earned a short laugh. Chio felt a hot flush of shame. This was the humiliation she had feared, not the work, but the gaze. She scrubbed the fabric harder, her knuckles raw, trying to make herself invisible. "Soldier!" A new voice cut through the steam. An American woman, in a crisp officer's uniform, was striding toward them. She was tall, with blonde hair tucked neatly under her cap. She did not look at the Japanese women. She looked directly at the guard. "Your post is at the perimeter, not in the laundry. Find something useful to do." Her voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that made the male guard immediately straighten up. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Miller," he mumbled, crushing out his cigarette and moving away quickly. The American nurse, Captain Miller, watched him go. Only then did she turn her attention to the women. She walked over to their tubs, her expression unreadable. She looked at their hands, red and chapped from the harsh lye. She said something to a corporal who had followed her, and the man returned a moment later with several new bars of soap. Captain Miller picked one up and handed it to Chio. It was not the rough, brown lye soap. It was a pale, creamy white bar. It smelled faintly of flowers, lavender perhaps. "This is better," Captain Miller said, gesturing to their hands. "Use this." She looked at the pile of cleaned, folded sheets. She nodded once, a sharp, appraising gesture. "Thank you," she said. And then she turned and left, her boots clicking decisively on the gravel. Chio stood holding the white bar of soap. It was a simple, domestic object, a smell of peace, of a life before the war. The hot breakfast had shattered her fear of the enemy. This bar of soap confused her sense of self. The guard's leer was familiar. It was the predictable contempt of a victor, but Captain Miller's intervention and her simple, polite "thank you" was not. She looked down at the soap, a small island of dignity in her raw hands. "Akiko," she said, her voice quiet. "Pass the next shirt." The laundry became their world. The days settled into a rhythm defined by steam, the caustic smell of lye, and the softer floral scent of the white soap Captain Miller had provided. The work was hard, physical, and relentless. They washed sheets stained with blood, mud, and penicillin. They scrubbed uniforms, surgical gowns, and bandages. At first, the work had been a humiliation, but Chio, trained in the strict discipline of a Tokyo hospital, could not tolerate inefficiency. She began to organize the women. Akiko was put in charge of sorting. Two of the stronger women handled the heavy, boiling tubs. Chio herself managed the folding, insisting on crisp, perfect corners, a small act of defiant order amid the chaos. They were prisoners, but they were also nurses. They understood the grim logistics of a hospital. They knew that clean laundry was as vital as medicine. The American hospital staff grew accustomed to their silent, efficient presence. The armed guards still watched from the perimeter, but the tension had eased. An unwritten rule of no fraternization existed, but small human gestures began to breach the wire. A soldier, waiting for a fresh set of sheets, might roll a stick of chewing gum toward Akiko. A corpsman might leave a half-eaten chocolate bar on a crate. The women accepted these gifts with suspicion, hiding them quickly, never acknowledging the giver. To be seen as friendly was a danger, not just from the guards, but from each other. Chio's attention, however, was fixed on Captain Miller. The American head nurse was a constant, stressed presence. She never spoke to the Japanese women directly again, but Chio watched her. She saw Miller arguing with a supply officer, her face tight with anger. She saw her gently comfort a young American soldier sobbing into his pillow as he was wheeled past the laundry shed. She saw the deep purple shadows under her eyes, identical to the ones Chio remembered, seeing on her own matron back in Saipan. One sweltering afternoon, the flow of wounded seemed endless. The laundry tubs were overflowing. Chio and her team worked without pausing, their arms aching, their faces slick with sweat. Chio looked up to see Captain Miller standing near the shed entrance, taking a rare, brief pause. She was leaning against a post, her shoulders slumped. She held a metal cup in her hands. It was coffee. Chio could smell the dark, nutty aroma even from a distance, the same scent from that first shocking breakfast. Miller drank it black, grimacing slightly at the taste. She looked exhausted. She looked, Chio realized with a jolt, exactly how Chio herself had felt in the cave on Saipan, running on nothing but nerve and caffeine, responsible for too many lives. As if feeling her gaze, Miller turned her head. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. There was no animosity in Miller's look, no contempt. She did not bark an order or look away in disgust. She simply held Chio's gaze for a long second, a look of profound, shared weariness passing between them. Then, Captain Miller gave a single, tired nod. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you. You're working." She straightened up, tossed the dregs of her coffee onto the gravel, and marched back into the chaos of the hospital. Chio stood frozen for a moment. The world had shifted again. The Americans were not a single entity of devils. The red-haired guard was awkward and kind. The leering soldier was a coward. And Captain Miller was a nurse. She was the enemy, yes, but she was also her counterpart. Chio turned back to the tub. "Akiko," she said, her voice sharper, more focused. "Fold faster. The surgical ward is waiting." The supplies for the laundry, the bars of white soap, the boxes of lye, the spools of twine, sometimes came wrapped in old American newspapers. At first, the women ignored them, bits of trash to be burned with the lint. But Chio, driven by the look of acknowledgement Captain Miller had given her, began to see them differently. They were a code. She started collecting them. A torn strip here, a crumpled half-page there. She hid them under the thin mattress of her cot. A dangerous secret. At night, long after the other women had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Chio would retrieve her collection. By the sliver of moonlight that cut through the hut's single high window, she would spread the scraps out. Her literacy in English was almost non-existent, built on a few required medical phrases, but she had a nurse's disciplined mind, and she had context. She recognized the words from her first day. Breakfast. She saw the word on the soap wrapper. Soap. She saw the word Miller had used. Thank you. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to build a vocabulary. Water, rain, bread, coffee. The words felt heavy and foreign on her tongue, the sounds of the enemy. But they were also the sounds of her survival. Akiko, sleeping, on the cot next to her, stirred one night. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She saw Chio hunched over the scraps of paper. Chio froze, her heart pounding. Akiko watched her for a long moment. She saw the intensity on Chio's face, the hidden papers. The younger nurse simply lay back down, pulling her thin blanket up to her chin, and said nothing. Her silence was a heavy, unspoken pact, a different kind of alliance. Chio's internal conflict was sharp. Was she a traitor for learning this language? Was she betraying her family, her emperor, by trying to understand the people who held her captive? She dismissed the thought. This was not about loyalty. It was about control. The Americans had taken her freedom, her clinic, her future. She would not allow them to keep her in ignorance. One night, she found a larger piece, a section of what looked like a camp newsletter. It was damp and smelled of newsprint and mildew. She smoothed it out. There were pictures of smiling soldiers. She struggled with a headline, her finger tracing the blocky letters, CHAPLAIN, SUNDAY, MASS, Z800, Sunday. She knew that word. Nichiobi. It clicked. The bells. Every Sunday morning, a clear metallic ringing would echo across the camp. Chio and the other women had assumed it was another form of military regiment, a call to formation. But it was a church bell. Mass. She knew the word from a Catholic mission near her old hospital. The guards, the men who had guns, the men who drove the jeeps, the men she had been taught were devils. They went to church. They prayed. The thought was as disorienting as the hot breakfast. Devils did not pray to a god. Devils did not drink coffee with weary politeness. Devils did not offer lavender-scented soap. The image of the Oni from the propaganda posters, with their sharp fangs and red eyes, wavered in her mind. It was being replaced by the face of the red-haired guard, the tired eyes of Captain Miller, and now the abstract sound of a church bell. From the distance across the camp, she could hear faint singing. It was a mournful, steady tune. It was not a Japanese song. It was a hymn. Chio folded the newspaper scrap, her hands steady. She had to learn more. The desire for knowledge became a physical hunger, as sharp as the need for food. The newspaper scraps were not enough. They were random fragments, whispers of a world she could not grasp. She needed something whole. She needed a book. She had seen a small wooden sign near the mess hall, one she had previously ignored. Now, with her fragmented vocabulary, she could decipher one word: library. It was a privilege for the American staff, of course, but the idea that books existed just a few hundred yards away was a torment. For 3 days, Chio planned her approach. She rehearsed the words in her head, her stomach twisting with the same fear she had felt in the cave. This was a different kind of risk. Not of violence, but of ridicule, of being misunderstood, of being put back in her place as a non-person. She chose her moment carefully. It was late afternoon. The laundry work was done for the day. Captain Miller was in her small, makeshift office, a desk pushed into the corner of the supply tent. She was bent over paperwork, a pencil tucked behind her ear, the ever-present metal cup of black coffee at her elbow. Chio entered the tent, carrying a perfectly folded stack of surgical towels. Akiko and the others watched her go, their eyes wide with fear for her. "Captain," Chio said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Miller did not look up, just waved a hand toward a shelf, assuming she was delivering the laundry. "Captain Miller," Chio said again, louder this time. Miller looked up, annoyed. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Chio standing there, not moving, clutching the towels like a shield. "What is it?" Miller's voice was sharp, tired. Chio's carefully rehearsed English evaporated. Her mind went blank, her face flushed with shame. She felt foolish, a child. She bowed her head, the ingrained gesture of subservience, and placed the towels on the desk. They were folded with perfect, sharp corners, a testament to her skill. Then her hand went to her pocket. She pulled out her most treasured scrap of newspaper, the one that mentioned the Sunday Mass. She placed it on top of the clean towels. She pointed first to the newspaper, then to her own eyes. "Read," she said. The word felt clumsy in her mouth. Miller frowned, confused. "You read?" "Yes, a little. Small." Chio held her fingers apart to show how little. She then pointed out the tent, in the general direction of the library sign. "Book," Chio said. "Please, book. Read." She hated how she sounded. Begging. Simple. But the desire was stronger than her pride. Captain Miller stared at her. The assumptions that governed the camp hung in the air. She is a prisoner. She is the enemy. She is uneducated. Chio's request, her careful folding, and her secret newspaper scraps did not fit this narrative. The captain picked up the newspaper scrap. She looked at the text Chio had circled. Chaplain, Sunday Mass. She looked back at Chio, a new calculating expression in her eyes. It was not kindness, not yet. It was surprise. "You want a book?" Miller stated, testing the words. Chio nodded, holding her breath. Miller was silent for a full minute. She tapped her pencil against the desk. The sound echoed the ticking clock in Chio's old hospital. "I will see," Miller said finally. It was not a yes. It was not a no. Chio bowed deeply, her heart hammering. "Thank you." She backed out of the tent, her mission accomplished, the suspense of the answer tightening her chest more than any fear of violence had. In late November, a strange energy filled the camp. The American Guard seemed agitated, but not with anger. It was a restless, almost cheerful energy that Chio found unsettling. She and Akiko were summoned from the laundry shed, not by a regular guard, but by Captain Miller's direct orderly. "You will work the evening meal. Officers' mess," the orderly instructed, speaking slowly. "Clean dresses, wash hands, clean." Fear returned, cold and immediate. A special detail, a night meal, serving the officers. This felt different, more dangerous, a proximity that broke the camp's unwritten rules. They were led to the mess hall, the same building where they ate their simple rations, but it was transformed. The long tables were covered not with bare metal, but with white tablecloths, real pressed linen. In the center of each table were small makeshift decorations, tinfoil, colorful shells, and jungle flowers. The room was hot and loud, filled with men laughing, their voices booming in the enclosed space. And the smell. It was overwhelming. It struck Chio with the force of a physical blow. It was not the simple smell of coffee or bacon. It was the complex, rich, savory scent of roasted meat, sweet baking spices, cinnamon, and hot bread. Chio and Akiko were positioned near the kitchen, their job simple: clear empty plates, refill water glasses. They were to be invisible. But Chio could not stop watching. She saw the men, officers she recognized, the camp commandant, the chaplain she had read about, eating with a desperate enthusiasm. They were serving heaping plates of turkey, mashed potatoes, and bright red cranberry sauce. In the corner, a soldier played a harmonica, a fast, cheerful tune. This was not a military formation. It was a feast. They were celebrating. While her family in Japan was likely starving, reduced to watery soup and tubers, these men were drowning in abundance. The propaganda had been right about American decadence, but wrong about the Oni. These were just loud, hungry men who missed their homes. As she moved to clear a side table, her eyes fell on a discarded copy of the Guam News. Her English was better now, slow but functional. She saw a headline near the bottom, an editorial. Her fingers traced the words she could make out. Too lenient. Japanese POWs. Our boys dying. The article was angry. It argued that treating prisoners with decency was a betrayal of the American soldiers still fighting. Chio felt a chill. Captain Miller, the books, the soap. These were not camp policy. They were exceptions. There were other Americans here who saw her exactly as she had first seen them, as a monster. A man stood up, tapping his glass. The room fell silent. It was the chaplain. He spoke for a long time, his voice low. Chio caught only a few words. Thankful, home, freedom, peace. Then every man bowed his head. They prayed. Chio froze by the wall. They were giving thanks for this food, this victory, while she, their prisoner, stood holding their dirty plates. The hypocrisy, the sincerity, it was all too much. Then came dessert. The men cheered as large orange pies were brought out. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg cut through, the savory air. Chio stared. She had never seen such a thing. She was clearing glasses near Captain Miller's seat. Miller was quiet, not joining the loud laughter, sipping her black coffee. She saw Chio looking at the pie. She watched the complex hunger, curiosity, and resentment warring in the nurse's eyes. Miller waited until the commandant was looking the other way. She took a clean side plate. With a quick, efficient motion, she cut a small, perfect sliver of the pumpkin pie. She slid the plate onto the tray Chio was holding. It was not an order. It was barely a gesture. It was a secret. Chio stared at the small orange triangle. This was not breakfast, a necessity for survival. This was a treat, a luxury. To accept it felt like a profound betrayal of her starving family. To refuse it felt like a rejection of the only person who saw her as human. She looked at Miller. The captain was already turned away, talking to the chaplain. Chio moved quickly, taking the tray and the pie back toward the shadows of the kitchen. The summer of 1945 burned hot and breathless. The work in the laundry continued, but the atmosphere in the camp had changed. The guards were tense, clustered around radios, speaking in low, urgent voices. They stopped shouting. Their patrols grew lax, their expressions distracted. Then the rumors started. They came from the male prisoners, who heard it from new arrivals. Whispers of a new kind of bomb, of cities turned to dust, of an imperial broadcast. Propaganda, one of the older women in the hut declared, her voice sharp. A trick. They want us to lose our spirit before they kill us. Chio said nothing. She continued to fold the white surgical towels, her corners still perfect, but her hands were unsteady. She had seen the Guam newspapers the guards were reading. The headlines were enormous, the words incomprehensible but shocking in their size. Emperor accepts terms. VJ Day. She felt a cold dread. If it was true, what did it mean? Surrender was not a concept her mind knew how to process. It was the ultimate failure, the final shame. What happened to prisoners when a war ended, when their labor was no longer needed? The editorial she had read months ago, the one demanding harshness, came back to her. Perhaps the kindness had just been a temporary convenience. One afternoon, the laundry work stopped completely. A guard told them, "Back to the hut, now." They sat in the hot, canvas-smelling darkness for hours. The usual sounds of the camp, the trucks, the shouted commands, the distant hum of the hospital generators had faded. The silence was absolute. "They are digging the graves," Akiko whispered, her voice trembling. "Be quiet," Chio snapped, her own fear making her cruel. The hut door opened. It was Captain Miller. She was not in her crisp work uniform, but in simpler fatigues. Her face was pale, and she looked older than Chio had ever seen her. The deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes were permanent. "All of you, outside, now," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The 16 women filed out, lining up in the harsh afternoon sun. This is it, Chio thought. This is the end. She reached for Akiko's hand. Miller stood before them, holding a clipboard. She looked down at it, then up at them. There was no victory in her eyes, no triumph. There was only a profound, bottomless weariness. "I have an official announcement," Miller said, her voice carrying in the stillness. "As of 3 days ago, the war is over. Your government has accepted the terms of surrender." A few women gasped. Akiko made a high, thin sound, like a strangled bird. One of the older women sank to her knees, her face vacant. Chio just stood there. The words echoed in the silence. "The war is over." "You will be processed for repatriation," Miller continued, reading from her clipboard. You are going home." Home. The word meant nothing. Chio tried to picture her village in Nagano, the cherry trees, her father's face. She couldn't. She saw only the face of the dead soldier in the cave, the red-haired guard's awkward smile, the steam from the coffee pot. This camp, this routine of laundry and fear and small, confusing kindnesses had become her reality. The war had been her purpose. First to serve, then to survive. Now both were gone. Akiko was crying, deep, racking sobs of relief, but Chio felt nothing. No joy, no relief, only a vast, terrifying emptiness. She had been raised to die for her emperor. He had surrendered. She had been taught the Americans were devils. They had given her coffee and soap and books. Every truth she had ever known was a lie. Captain Miller finished speaking and walked away. Her shoulders slumped. Chio looked up. For the first time, she realized the sky above Guam was silent. There were no bombers, no distant artillery, just the wind. September 1945. The air at Opera Harbor was thick with salt and diesel fumes. A large gray transport ship waited at the pier. The silence that had fallen over the camp in August was gone, replaced by the organized chaos of departure. The 16 women, now classified as repatriated civilian internees, stood in a quiet line, holding small bundles of issued supplies. They had been given new, plain cotton clothing and shoes that did not fit well. Akiko was vibrating with a nervous energy, her eyes wide as she stared at the ship. "We are going home, Chio-san," she whispered, as if saying it too loud might break the spell. Chio merely nodded. Home. The word still felt hollow, a place she could see in her memory but could no longer feel. She felt a profound, aching guilt. She had survived. She had eaten hot breakfasts while her family starved. She had read American books while her brother died for the emperor. She was returning, not as a hero, but as a failure who had been treated with confusing kindness. She looked at the American sailors managing the pier. They were young, laughing, chewing gum. They were not the Oni from the cave. They were not the stoic, tired men from the hospital. They were just boys, relieved the war was over. Her line moved forward to a folding table, where an officer with a clipboard processed their papers. Each woman had to sign her name, or, if she could not write, leave a thumbprint. As Chio approached the table, she saw a familiar figure standing nearby, observing the process. Captain Miller. She was wearing her formal uniform, the khaki sharp and pressed. Her expression was the same as always, neutral, professional, exhausted. She was not there to say goodbye. She was there to ensure the transfer was completed according to protocol. Chio stepped up to the table. The officer checked her name. Chio Tanaka. Hi. She signed her name, the Roman letters awkward but clear. As she handed the pen back, she looked at Captain Miller. This was the last time. This was the woman who had stopped the guard in the laundry, who had given her coffee, who had understood her request for books, who had passed her a slice of pie. This was the woman who had announced the end of her world. Chio gave a short, formal bow. Captain, she said. Miller nodded, her gaze clinical. Chio straightened. She summoned the English she had practiced in the dark, the words stolen from newspapers and novels. Thank you, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. For coffee. For book. Captain Miller's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. The mask of command flickered. She looked at Chio, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a prisoner, but as a nurse. Miller held out a small, cloth-wrapped object. You left this in the laundry, she said. Chio knew it was a lie. She had meticulously cleared her few possessions. She unwrapped the cloth. It was the copy of Jane Eyre. Chio stared at it. It was contraband. It was a gift. It was a recognition. It is permitted? Chio asked. The war is over, nurse, Miller said. It was the first time she had used her title. Your property is returned. Chio took the book. She held its weight in her hands. She bowed again, deeper this time. When she looked up, Miller was already turning away, her duty done. Tanaka, move on, a sailor called. Chio turned and walked up the echoing metal gangplank. She did not look back at the receding island of Guam, an island of death and of impossible kindness. She clutched the book to her chest. As the transport ship pulled away from the harbor, she found a place on the crowded deck. She looked east, toward an ocean that led to a home she did not know, holding the one thing that made sense, a story, written in the language of her enemy, given to her by a colleague.